Hi, this is handcrafted by Jason Cooper. I'm in the shop today working on a small decoration project that a lot of people have requested from me. Now that it's one of those things, you make one and someone sees it and then they want one, but it's a cedar star. Whoops, that's the back side. Let's show the front side. There we go. Cedar star. We had one hanging on the front of our house, and just kind of went from there. Anyway, I'm going to show you how to make that today. It's not too complicated, although there's a lot of angles and it's really easy to get off a little bit, and it makes a big difference down the line, but I'm confident you can do it. Before you watch the rest of this, go ahead and hit subscribe on YouTube, and if you're on my website, hit subscribe to my email newsletter, and I'd love to connect with you that way. So here we go. So the first step in making a star is simply cutting some pieces to length so that I can run them through my jig and put all the angles on them that I need, clean them up, get ready to go. These are just 1x4 cedar fence pickets, 1x4 by 60 inches with a dog ear on one end that I picked up at Menards. I'm going to square off the end and I'm going to cut 4 pieces out of each of this, so they'll be a little over 14 inches long, 14 and a half or so. And that'll be the first step. I'll cut enough to make a couple stars. I've got about 5 pickets here, and that should be plenty. And then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now I've cut my pieces to the length I want. It's a little bit over 14 and a half inches. It doesn't really matter. You can make them however long you want to. That's just what I have chosen. Next step is I'm going to square up these edges. Even though this is rough cedar and it looks pretty good like that, I found that once I run them through the jig or whatever, I've got some uneven edges and they don't line up right, and it throws off my angles just a smidge. And by the time you take an angle spread over 10 pieces, if it's off just a little bit, that gets magnified. So I'm going to square these all up on the edges. That's the next step. Okay, so now I've squared up the sides of all of these pieces, so I should have nice straight edges on all of my pieces. There's the rest of them. And now it's time to use the jig. Now this jig really makes doing the stars much easier. And what this is, it's just a scrap piece of plywood. You can see this is only maybe 8 or 9 inches across and 18 inches, 20 inches in length. It's not real big. And then I've got some scrap 1x2s that I used to screw down to the plywood at the proper angle. Now to make this star, you're going to need to cut this angle at 18 degrees. So you need some kind of a protractor, some way to measure it. You can get one of these at the home store, Menards, whatever. Set it up, set your angle. You have to be as precise as possible, because like I said, if you mess it up a little bit, it gets multiplied over 10 different cuts. And so a 1 degree mistake at this point results in 10 degrees of difference at the end once you put all the pieces together. But you get that set up at the 18 degrees, and this one is at 90 degrees to that, and you'll see in a later step how this comes into play. But for now, it allows us to put our piece in there. Oops, kind of up against the socket there. Fix that. Put our piece in there. I've added a clamp, hold down clamp. Clamp it down and keep my fingers away from the blade while I run this through the saw. Now we're going to keep all these offcuts because I can use those to make a smaller version of the star later on. If you're a little more planned ahead a little bit more, you could cut this to the right length so that these were essentially symmetrical when you cut them, and you'd be ready to go. But this is the next step, just running them through the jig, cutting that 18-degree angle. Okay, so I just ran all of these pieces through the jig. I'm actually going to end up making a couple of stars, and here's all my offcuts. And like I said, we're going to actually save those. I'm going to run those through the saw a little bit later, make a smaller version, and use those for, nothing gets thrown away, basically. But I want to show you something here. I lined up all the back edges along the fence nice and square, and I wanted to make sure this line was pretty straight. And I also want to make sure this end was pretty well in line. You can see it's off a little bit, but it's not going to be that big a deal. we're going to be able to work with that. If I hadn't trimmed off the edges of these and got them nice and straight, this would have varied a lot more because they wouldn't all have sat properly in the jig. And if you notice while I was doing that, you got to make sure you get this edge nice and square up to that 1x2 there before you clamp it down so that it stays nice and straight. The other thing I wanted to mention is you can pick up this for about $5-6. This was about the same, a protractor, so you can get your angles right, and a hold down clamp. I'll have links to those below the video, both on YouTube and on my site, where you can get those. The next step is to take all the pieces and put them in pairs, and then we're going to assemble them. And I'm just going to use pocket hole screws and pocket holes on these, and I'll show you that here in a minute when I do a little bit of layout. Okay, so now I've got a rough layout of one of my stars, and at this point I haven't screwed anything together yet, haven't drilled the holes, but what I'm doing is I'm laying out looking for a good side and a bad side. So the side of these I like best, I'm turning it up, ranging them. For these that have maybe a little more color to them, I'm making sure I've got them kind of scattered evenly rather than just all together. So just getting the rough layout that I want. And as you can see here, I still have more work to do, more angles to be cut, but we're going to assemble these first, because this way we can actually use the same jig that we just did, putting it in like this to make these other cuts, flipping it and doing it again, and you'll see that later. But for now it's time to make some pocket holes on these stars along the edges that we just cut, but we'll do it on the back side. So in the next step, I'm going to flip all these over because I want this to be the side that ends up on the front. I'm going to flip all these over, and then I'm going to pick the same side from each leg to put the pocket holes on, because they only need to be on one side. You only do that from one side of the board, and that will be the next step. Okay, so now I'm ready for the next step. I got all 5 pieces of my star screwed together, pocket holes drilled and ready to go. And I did want to mention, if you don't have a pocket hole jig, this is the cheapest one you can get. It's a single pocket hole jig, comes with the bit, as well as a driver for those square head pocket hole screws. I'll drop some links for those as well. This is just a face frame clamp, and I clamp it to the edge of the table saw to hold that down in place. You could use any other kind of clamp you want, just to hold it in place. A C-clamp or one of those quick clamps would work too. And then you need some pocket hole screws. And these are, Kreg is the brand that people associate with pocket holes. K-R-E-G, and I just recommend using their screws because it works with their system well. They're a great thing to have, regardless of, not just for this project, but for any project, come in very handy. So the next step is to cut the proper angle on this end of the board. Now the reality is we need a 54-degree cut. Now we could have done that at the miter saw before we screwed these together, put the straight edge up there, made our 54-degree cut. But it turns out you can use the jig, now that you've got it assembled, put this in there, aligning that edge, bringing that all the way down, clamping it down, and that turns out to be the correct angle. So that is what we're going to do to make it simpler. Don't have to use another saw, don't have to set up the table saw differently. We just have to set the distance between the fence and the blade to where it's going to, cut the wood where we need it to cut. In this case, I like to maximize my material, but I could cut off more, and then this center portion of the star would end up being a little smaller. Whatever that piece size is right there, that's how big the little center portion of your star will be. So that's the next step, is to run these through the jig one more time. Run it through one side, flip it, run through the other. Okay, I've got my star pieces all cut. After I ran them through the jig, I laid them out like this, and I had some pretty big gaps, so I had to fine tune that using my miter gauge on my table saw here, trimming off just a little bit consistently with all of them. Need to fine tune my jig just a little bit apparently to make that perfect the first time. But you'll run into that where you get all the way done, and like I said, with 10 cuts, 10 pieces, that any slight variation gets magnified 10 times. But I did want to show you that it's come together just fine. There is just a tiny little bit of gap, and from my experience in building these before, I know that for the most part I can pull that together with the screws when I assemble it. So that will be the next step, is assembling these. And what I'll do is the same process. Just drill the pocket holes in one side of each leg of the arm, and that's it. Assemble it. Now, optionally, you can put a little glue in these joints. You could use biscuits. There's all sorts of ways that you could assemble these. Since this is just a decoration, it doesn't need to bear a lot of weight or anything like that. I'm not going to bother with glue. The one thing that I will do is I'll go around in the ends here, because that first piece that's holding it, that first screw is clear down here. I will hold these where I want them and drive one brad nail in each of these, just to keep them from going like this over time as they dry out, just to hold a little bit. You could put just a little bit of glue down those joints as well, whatever you need to do to make it like you want it. And that's the next step. So there it is, one completed star. This one is about 28 inches across, and again, just built of rough cedar. They're actually fence pickets picked up at the local store. Pretty inexpensive. As I mentioned, with all your angles, it's easy to have a few little gaps. Don't let that stress you out too much. For the most part, you can pull those together with the screws when you put it together. It's bound to happen. Especially if you only make one. If you make a bunch of these, you're going to be able to refine your jig, adjust your process a little bit, and make it perfect the first time and not have those troubles. But like I said, for a decoration, that's not too bad. Or as my grandpa would say, it's good enough for the girls I go with.